The air in Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it felt less like a place to eat and more like a museum for egos, was thick with the scent of truffle oil and quiet money. For Clara Bellini, it was the smell of another 12-hour shift on her feet, another night of feigned smiles and aching arches. At 22, she was a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's opulent lives, a student of historical preservation by day and a purveyor of overpriced scallops by night. The tuition for her master's program and the mounting bills for her grandmother's long-term care facility were a two-headed beast, and this job, demeaning as it often was the only sword she had. Bellini, Table 7 needs more bread. Table 12 is complaining about the temperature of their chablis. And for God's sake, try to look like you're not attending a funeral. Marcus Thorne, the floor manager, hissed the words without moving his lips, a ventriloquist of contempt. He was a man whose ambition had curdled into petty tyranny, his cheap suit a constant, shiny reminder of the heights he'd never reach. Clara just nodded, her face a carefully constructed mask of placid obedience. Yes, Marcus. Pride was a luxury, like sleep or a savings account. She didn't have it. Then the silence fell. It wasn't a gradual quieting. It was a sudden, suffocating vacuum, as if the entire cavernous dining room had collectively held its breath. The double oak doors at the entrance swung open, and a man stepped inside. He didn't walk so much as cleave a path through the atmosphere. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed woven from shadow and steel. His hair was the color of jet, swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and severe beauty. This was Alessandro Sterling, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms with the same reverence and fear once reserved for emperors. He was a phantom, a recluse who ran a global tech and logistics empire from the highest floors of the city, but was almost never seen in public. Marcus Thorne looked as if he'd swallowed a block of ice. "It's him," he whispered, his voice trembling. The entire staff froze. Chefs peered through the kitchen porthole. Bartenders stopped polishing glasses. "VIP 1, Marcus croaked, shoving a water pitcher into the hands of the most senior waitress, a woman named Isabel. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. Just exist flawlessly." For the next 45 minutes, Aurelia became a stage for a silent, excruciating play. Isabel approached, poured water, and was dismissed with a flick of the wrist. Marcus himself presented the wine list, only for Sterling to stare straight through him as if he were made of glass. The head chef sent out a complimentary amuse-bouche, a delicate quail egg on a nest of fried leeks. It sat untouched. Alessandro Sterling didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. He sat alone at the best table in the house, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the plate-glass window, a statue of profound, unnerving stillness. Isabel returned to the service station, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "He won't even look at the menu. He just sits there. It's like serving a black hole." Marcus was frantic, his face a mottled red. He scanned his staff, his eyes landing on Clara with a cruel gleam. "You, Bellini. Go." Clara blinked. "Me? But I'm not senior staff. I just handle overflow and bussing. Isabel is about to have a panic attack, and you're the only one who doesn't look like a terrified rabbit. Go over there. See if he wants to order. And if you mess this up..." He leaned in, his breath sour with cheap coffee. "Don't just clear your locker. Burn it." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed down her simple black apron, took a steadying breath, and walked out of the shadows. The eyes of every diner, every staff member, followed her. As she approached the table, she didn't focus on the man's reputation. She focused on the details, a habit from her studies in preservation. You couldn't understand an artifact without observing its context, its wear, its subtle imperfections. The man's suit was flawless, but his left cufflink was a simple, unadorned piece of dark, worn metal, unlike the platinum gleam of the right. His hands were still, but there was a faint tension in his knuckles, as if he were gripping something invisible. And his eyes, which everyone assumed were scanning the Manhattan skyline, weren't. They were focused, with an unnerving intensity, on the mouths of the people at the adjacent table, watching the cadence of their conversation. He wasn't looking. He was reading. And then she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible scar, a silvery line running from just behind his earlobe down into his hairline. It was the kind of scar left by a specific, older type of mastodectomy surgery. A surgery for profound hearing loss. The realization hit her not like a lightning bolt, but like the slow, quiet dawn of a terrible understanding. He wasn't being arrogant. He wasn't being rude. He was deaf. And in a place like this, a cacophony of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and intrusive music, he was utterly, profoundly isolated. The silence wasn't a weapon he was wielding. It was the prison he lived in. She reached his table. He didn't acknowledge her. She stood for a moment, the crystal water pitcher in her hand, feeling impossibly heavy. She could follow Marcus's orders, speak into the void, and be dismissed like the others. Or she could do something else. She noticed the table had the slightest wobble, a tiny imperfection in this temple of perfection. It was barely perceptible, but his hand on the table was so still, she imagined he must feel the vibration with every footstep that passed. Without a word, she knelt. It was a subservient gesture, one that made Marcus Thorne cringe from across the room, but her purpose was different. She wasn't begging for an order. She was fixing a problem. She slipped a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket and slid it under the short leg, testing it until it was perfectly stable. As she did, she looked up, catching his gaze for the first time. His eyes, a startling shade of grey like a stormy sea, were narrowed, not with disdain, but with sharp, analytical curiosity. And then, without thinking, the words slipped out. Not in English. They were a whisper, barely audible, in the nearly extinct Ladine dialect of the Dolomite Mountains, the language of her nonna. A phrase her grandmother, a master clockmaker, would murmur when calibrating the delicate balance of a timepiece. Il mondo si regge su un equilibrio sottile. The world rests on a subtle balance. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Alessandro Sterling didn't just look at her. He recoiled as if she had struck him. The icy facade shattered, and for the first time that night, raw, unguarded shock flared in his eyes. He leaned forward, his entire body thrumming with a sudden, ferocious energy. His lips formed the word. His voice, when it came, was a low, gravelly sound, rusty from disuse in this public space. Again. The entire restaurant seemed to gasp in unison. Marcus looked like he was about to faint. Clara switched back to English, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry, sir. It's just an old saying my grandmother used to use. I just meant the table. He stood up. He was taller than she'd realized, a towering, imposing figure. He rounded the table, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly over her. He smelled of expensive wool and something clean, like mountain air after a storm. That dialect, he said, his voice low and intense, his eyes scanning her face as if deciphering an ancient text. It is from the Valle d'Ombra, the Shadow Valley. There are fewer than 1,000 speakers left in the world. None of them are waitresses in Manhattan. His gaze dropped to her name tag. Clara Bellini. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his expression was a maelstrom of disbelief, suspicion, and a desperate, flickering hope. My grandmother. She was from there, Clara whispered, intimidated by his sheer intensity. His gaze fell to the simple silver chain around her neck. A small, tarnished locket, a family heirloom she never took off, was tucked beneath the collar of her uniform. Before she could react, he reached out, not to touch her, but to point a long, steady finger at it. "What is inside that locket?" he demanded. "Nothing. A piece of my mother's hair. It's rusted shut." He didn't believe her. He took a step back, his mind clearly racing. He looked over her shoulder, his eyes finding the terrified face of Marcus Thorne. Alessandro reached into his jacket, pulled out a black titanium credit card, and tossed it onto the now stable table. The metallic clink echoed in the silent room. "Manager!" Alessandro's voice boomed, clear and commanding. Marcus scurried over, sweating through his polyester suit. "Mr. Sterling." "Yes, sir." "I am so sorry for the disturbance. This employee is new. I will have her fired and removed at once." "Quiet," Alessandro said, his voice cutting through Marcus's babbling like a razor. "You will bring me the bill for every single table in this restaurant, and then you will bring me the termination paperwork for this young woman's employment contract." Marcus blinked, his brain short-circuiting. "Sir, everyone?" "Everyone," Alessandro confirmed. He then turned his storm-grey eyes back to Clara, and his next words shattered her world far more completely than any dropped plate. "Because she is no longer your employee. As of this moment, she works for me. I am absolutely not going anywhere with you." Clara planted her worn-out work shoes on the wet pavement outside Aurelia. A cold, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, making the city lights bleed across the asphalt. A gleaming black Maybach was idling at the curb, its rear door held open by a chauffeur who looked more like a Secret Service agent. Alessandro Sterling stood under the vast black canopy of an umbrella, completely unbothered by the chaos he had just created. "Miss Bellini, you are being irrational," he stated, his tone devoid of the emotion that had flared inside the restaurant. The icy control was back. "You no longer have a job. I saw your manager's face. He was not terminating your contract for me. He was terminating it with pleasure. You cannot go back." "You caused that scene. You can't just purchase a person," she shot back, clutching her thin cardigan around her. She was cold, exhausted, and her mind was still reeling. "I did not purchase you. I hired you," he corrected calmly. "A verbal contract is binding. Your salary is now $500,000 a year, plus expenses. Now, please get in the car." Clara choked on the rain-soaked air. 500. What? That was more money than her family had seen in 3 generations combined. It would solve everything. The tuition, Nonna's medical bills, the leaky roof on their tiny Queen's apartment. It would save them. "For what?" she asked, her voice a suspicious whisper. "What could I possibly do for you that's worth that kind of money?" He stepped closer, bringing her under the shelter of his umbrella. The sudden proximity was overwhelming. Up close, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He wasn't just a monolith of power. He was a man carrying an immense weight. "My mother was from the Valle d'Ombra," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "She was an artisan, a genius. She died when I was a boy. She left behind her work, her journals, all written in that dialect. For 20 years I have employed the world's foremost linguists. They can translate the words, but they cannot understand the meaning. It is a language of craft, of nuance. They can read the recipe, but they cannot cook the meal. You, however," he paused, his gaze intense. "You spoke it like a native. I need you to translate her legacy." It sounded plausible, almost, but the desperation in his eyes told her there was more to it. Still, the offer was a lifeline. She was drowning too fast to refuse. "Where are we going?" she asked, the fight draining out of her. "To my home. We will discuss the details there." She hesitated, looking from the warm, dry interior of the car back to the cold, indifferent city. She had just been fired, humiliated, and now a mysterious, deaf billionaire was offering her a fortune to translate a dead language. It was insane. But so was trying to survive on $7 an hour in tips. Clara got in the car. The door closed with a soft, definitive thud, sealing them in a world of silent, fragrant leather. Alessandro sat opposite her, the cavernous space of the Maybach feeling both intimate and immense. He tapped a command into a tablet, and a privacy screen slid up, separating them from the driver. "You have questions," he stated. Not asked. He was watching her mouth again, his focus absolute. "How did you know I wasn't just repeating a phrase I'd overheard?" she asked. "The cadence," he said simply. "The syntax, it was fluid. It was knowledge, not mimicry. Also," he added, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, "I saw the look on your face when you knelt to fix the table. You weren't trying to impress me. You were correcting an imperfection. That is the mindset of an artisan, the mindset of my mother." Clara felt a chill. He hadn't just heard her words. He had seen the intention behind them. "My grandmother was a clockmaker, the best in the valley," she used to say. "She taught me." This was the truth, and she saw in his face that he recognized it. "What is your grandmother's name?" he asked, his voice tight. "Elena Bellini." Alessandro Sterling went utterly still. The name seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. He looked away, staring out the tinted window as the car sped through the glistening streets. He didn't say another word for the entire journey. His home was the top 3 floors of the Sterling Tower, a private residence that made the palatial estates of kings look modest. They stepped out of a private elevator directly into a sprawling living space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan. The apartment was a testament to minimalist wealth, all clean lines, priceless art, and cold, empty spaces. He led her not to a living room, but to a vast, climate-controlled workshop. It was filled with drafting tables, complex machinery she didn't recognize, and glass cases containing intricate, beautiful objects that looked like metallic sculptures. They were clock movements, gears and escapements of impossible complexity. "My mother, Livia Sterling, was not just an artisan," Alessandro said, his voice echoing in the large room. "She was an alchemist. The people of her valley guarded a secret for centuries, a way of forging a unique metal alloy. It is lighter than titanium, stronger than steel, and completely resistant to magnetic fields. In the world of horology, of high-precision instruments, it is priceless. A holy grail." He gestured to a large, unfinished metal sphere on a central workbench. "She was working on this when she died, a chronometer of unprecedented accuracy. But the secret of the alloy died with her. Her journals describe the process, but they are filled with the idioms and metaphors of the valley. Heat the crucible until the mountain weeps. Quench the metal when the moon sings to the wolf. It is poetry. My engineers see it as madness." Now Clara understood. This wasn't just about translation. It was about interpretation. It was a puzzle that only someone with a foot in both worlds could solve. "And my grandmother, Elena Bellini?" she asked softly. Alessandro finally turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was one of profound, weary sorrow. "Elena Bellini was your grandmother. She was also my mother's apprentice, her closest friend. They fled the valley together 25 years ago, after a disagreement with the village elders about sharing their secrets with the outside world. My mother came here. Elena, we were told, disappeared. We thought she was dead." Clara sank onto a nearby stool, her legs suddenly weak. Her grandmother's stories of the old country were always vague, tinged with a sadness Clara had never understood. She had run away. She had hidden. "Now," Alessandro said, his voice regaining its sharp edge, "the locket." Her hand went to her neck. "I told you, it's just—" "Please, Clara, do not insult my intelligence." He walked to a workbench and picked up a small, velvet-lined tray. "May I?" Hesitantly, she unclasped the chain and handed it to him. He took the locket, his long, nimble fingers examining its surface. He ignored the clasp. Instead, he ran his thumb over the intricate floral engraving on the front. He paused, pressing a specific petal on the rose. There was a faint click. He then twisted the bail, the small loop that held it to the chain, counterclockwise. It wasn't rusted shut, it was a puzzle box. The locket sprang open. Inside there was no lock of hair. There was a tiny, intricately folded piece of dark, shimmering metal, no bigger than her pinky nail. And on the inside of the lid, a microscopic inscription. Alessandro picked up a jeweler's loupe, his hand surprisingly steady. He read the inscription aloud, his voice a low whisper. "La chiave non è il metallo, ma la mano che lo forma." Clara translated instinctively. "The key is not the metal, but the hand that shapes it." "It's the final piece," Alessandro breathed, staring at the sliver of metal. "The catalyst, the one element my mother never wrote down." He looked up at Clara, and for the first time she saw not a billionaire or a recluse, but a son who had spent 20 years trying to finish his mother's final symphony. "You didn't just bring me the language, Clara. You brought me the key." Suddenly, a shrill alarm blared through the penthouse. Red lights flashed along the ceiling. On a large monitor on the wall, a security schematic of the building lit up. A breach. Private elevator. Ascending. Alessandro didn't panic. A chilling transformation came over him. The grief vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal calm. He strode to a section of the wall that looked like a bookcase, pressed a specific volume, and the entire section slid open to reveal a vault. He pulled out a sleek, black handgun and a small earpiece, which he fitted into his ear. "Who is it?" Clara cried, her voice shaking. "The one person who knew my mother was close to perfecting her work before she died," Alessandro said, his eyes fixed on the elevator's progress on the screen. He checked the magazine of the gun with practiced efficiency. "The one person who has been trying to take this company from me since the day I inherited it." He looked at her, his grey eyes like chips of flint. "My uncle, Julian Sterling." The elevator pinged, arriving at their floor. "He must have tracked your hiring, put 2 and 2 together," Alessandro said grimly. "He knows who you are. He knows what you have." He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her toward the back of the workshop. "He won't get it." He didn't point the gun at the door. He pointed it at her. "Give me the locket." Clara stared at him, then at the gun, then back at his face. It was a cold, calculated mask. "What are you doing?" "He is here for that piece of metal. He will not hesitate to kill you to get it. The only thing that keeps you alive is if I have it. Now give it to me." It wasn't a request. It was the desperate calculus of a man who saw only one move left on the chessboard. The elevator doors slid open. Julian Sterling strode into the workshop as if he owned it. He was older than Alessandro, softer around the middle, but he possessed the same sharp Sterling features, twisted by years of resentment. He was flanked by two large men in dark suits who moved with the quiet efficiency of trained killers. "Well, well, nephew," Julian said, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. "Working late? And with a new lab assistant, I see. A rather pretty one." His eyes, a pale, watery blue, slid over Clara, dismissing her as insignificant. Alessandro didn't lower the gun. He kept it trained on Clara's chest, his body shielding her from his uncle's view. "Get out, Julian." "Oh, I don't think so," Julian chuckled, strolling closer. He stopped when he was a few feet away, his gaze falling on the open locket and the tiny piece of metal on the velvet tray. His eyes widened with avaricious glee. So, the little ghost from the mountains finally delivered her package. Livia's final secret. "Hand it over, Alex. Don't make this unpleasant." "This is my mother's legacy, my inheritance," Alessandro said, his voice a low growl. "Your mother was a sentimental fool who would rather hide her genius than profit from it. That alloy is worth trillions. It belongs to the company. It belongs to me," Julian spat, his cordial mask slipping. "Now give it to me, or the girl dies. A simple choice." Clara's blood ran cold. She was trapped between two powerful, ruthless men, a pawn in a game that had started before she was born. "You see, Julian," Alessandro said, a cold, dangerous smile touching his lips. "You've misunderstood the situation. You think she is my leverage." He pressed the muzzle of the gun gently against Clara's collarbone. "You're wrong. She is my liability. I have the catalyst now. I don't need her anymore." Julian's smile faltered. He looked from Alessandro's merciless face to Clara's terrified one. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't kill an innocent." "Innocent?" Alessandro laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Her family helped my mother hide this from the world for 25 years. Their sentimentality has cost this company billions. There's nothing innocent about that." He cocked the hammer of the gun. The click was deafeningly loud in the tense silence. "Last chance, Julian. Leave. Or I will remove the final loose end myself, and you will walk away with nothing." Clara squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. This was how she died, betrayed by the man who had promised to save her. But then she felt it. Alessandro's hand, the one holding her arm, squeezed a rapid, rhythmic pattern against her bicep. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Morse code, SOS. It was a bluff, a terrifying, convincing bluff, but a bluff nonetheless. He was trying to buy time. He needed her to play along. Clara forced her eyes open. She channeled every ounce of fear and anger into a look of pure defiance. She stared directly at Julian. "Do it!" she spat, her voice shaking but clear. "Shoot me. I would rather die than let a greedy vulture like you touch my grandmother's legacy." The move was brilliant. It completely reframed the narrative. She wasn't a victim. She was a martyr, a guardian of the secret. Julian, who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss, was momentarily stunned by a motive he couldn't comprehend. That moment was all Alessandro needed. "You're right," Alessandro said softly to Clara, his voice laced with mock admiration. "A fitting end." Then, in a movement so fast it was a blur, he wasn't aiming at her anymore. He shoved her violently to the floor behind the heavy steel workbench and spun, firing 2 shots. Not at Julian, but at the 2 bodyguards. They crumpled to the ground, not dead, but shot with tactical precision in their legs. Julian roared in fury, pulling a small silver pistol from his jacket. But Alessandro was already moving, using the workshop's tables and machinery as cover, herding Julian away from the exit, deeper into the labyrinth of his mother's work. "You can't win, Alex," Julian shouted, firing a wild shot that ricocheted off a metal press. "The board is already on my side. They see you as a liability, a deaf cripple playing with his mother's old toys." Clara, huddled behind the workbench, saw her chance. While they were distracted, she crawled towards the central workbench where the locket lay. Her mind was racing. La chiave non è il metallo, ma la mano che lo forma. The key is not the metal, but the hand that shapes it. It was a riddle. Her grandmother was a clockmaker. Alessandro's mother was an alchemist. They didn't think like engineers. They thought in systems, in processes. The catalyst wasn't the key. The shaping was the key. She looked at the unfinished chronometer on the table, then at the complex schematics on a nearby screen. Her eyes scanned the Latin phrases scrawled in the margins. It wasn't just a recipe. It was a set of instructions for a machine. This machine. The chronometer wasn't a timepiece. It was the forge. Another shot rang out, closer this time. "Clara, the emergency shutter!" Alessandro yelled, diving behind a lathe as Julian advanced. She saw a large red button on the wall. She scrambled towards it and slammed her hand down. Heavy steel shutters began to descend over the massive windows, plunging the room into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the emergency lights and the glow of the monitors. They were trapped. "Nowhere to run, nephew!" Julian crowed, stalking through the shadows. Clara's eyes darted back to the schematic. One phrase stood out, one her nonna had used often when frustrated with a delicate mechanism. "La pazienza modella la pietra, la fretta, la frantuma." Patience shapes the stone. Haste shatters it. Haste. She looked at the control panel for the chronometer forge. There was a sequence for activation, a slow, methodical process. But there was also an emergency override, a purge cycle, designed for rapid heating and cooling to clean the chamber. Haste. She knew what she had to do. It was a wild, desperate gamble, born from a half-remembered phrase and a flash of insight. She grabbed the tiny piece of metal from the tray. "Julian!" she yelled, her voice high with calculated panic. "Here, take it! Just don't hurt him!" She held up the shimmering catalyst. Julian stopped, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. He turned his back on Alessandro's last known position, focusing entirely on her. "Wise choice, girl. Throw it to me, slowly." Okay, she cried. She didn't throw it to him. She lunged for the chronometer, pried open the small loading port for the central crucible, and tossed the metal inside. Then she slammed her fist down on the emergency purge button. The machine roared to life with a deafening hum. A brilliant blue light emanated from the core. "What have you done?" Julian shrieked, realizing he'd been tricked. He raised his gun to fire at her. But Alessandro was there. He exploded from the shadows, tackling his The shriek of the machine was the sound of a star dying. It clawed at the air, a physical vibration that resonated in Clara's bones, a counterpoint to the frantic, silent scream trapped in her own throat. On the monitor, the numbers bled downwards with sickening speed. 60 seconds. The blue light pulsing from the chronometer's core was no longer beautiful. It was the malevolent glare of a singularity, threatening to tear their world apart from the inside out. Patience shapes the stone. Haste shatters it. Her grandmother's words were a death sentence she had pronounced upon them all. She had not activated a forge. She had armed a failsafe, a final, scorched earth act of preservation Livia Sterling had encoded into her life's work. A bomb. Alessandro saw it in her eyes. Locked in a brutal, desperate grapple with Julian, He saw the dawning, soul-crushing horror on her face, and understood. His own strategic mind, a fortress of logic and control, had been breached by a single, catastrophic variable, a poetic idiom he could never have interpreted. In that split second, his fight with Julian ceased to be about legacy or revenge. It became a primal, savage calculus of survival. He drove the heel of his palm up under Julian's nose, a sharp, concussive blow that sent the older man reeling back with a wet gasp, blood blossoming across his face. The world narrowed to the wailing alarm and the ticking clock. Alessandro's gaze swept the workshop, not as a room, but as a system of interconnected parts, a puzzle to be solved against an impossible deadline. His eyes landed on a schematic, left open on a secondary monitor, one Clara had been studying earlier. It wasn't the master plan for the forge. It was a sub-system diagram for the cooling loop. "The coolant manifold," he roared, his voice a raw command that sliced through the noise. "Behind the main press, there's a manual release valve." Julian, clutching his face, saw Clara's head snap towards the massive hydraulic press in the corner. A sneer twisted his bloody features. "There's no escape, nephew. My men are outside that door. Even if you survive this, you lose." He lunged, not for Alessandro, but for a heavy steel caliper on a nearby workbench, intending to hurl it at Clara. Alessandro moved with a chilling economy of motion. He didn't intercept. He didn't block. He pivoted on his heel, grabbed the edge of the heavy steel workbench Julian was staggering past, and heaved. The entire table, laden with tools and unfinished components, tipped over with a deafening crash of tortured metal, pinning Julian's leg beneath it. A sharp, ugly crack echoed under the din, followed by a howl of pure agony. Face off 40 seconds. Clara was already at the manifold. It wasn't a simple wheel. It was a complex junction of pipes, insulated against extreme temperatures, with a recessed, hexagonal bolt at its center. It required a specific tool, a tool she saw hanging in its designated slot on a magnetic board 10 feet away. Too far. Her mind, honed by years of studying the intricate workings of antique clocks, saw a different solution. She ripped a thin metal T-square from a drafting table. It wouldn't fit. But beside it lay a set of heavy, industrial files. Her hands worked with a frantic, inherited precision that bypassed conscious thought. Bracing the T-square against the concrete floor with her foot, she began filing down 2 of its arms with desperate, rasping strokes, shavings of metal flying like sparks. "Clara, what are you doing? There's no time!" Alessandro yelled, pulling the whimpering Julian away from the wreckage, his eyes locked on the countdown. "The key is not the metal, but the hand that shapes it," she screamed back, the words a mantra, a prayer. She was no longer just translating a phrase, she was living it. She was shaping the key. 30 seconds. The metal was rough, imperfect, but it was close enough. She jammed the makeshift tool into the hexagonal recess. It caught. She threw her entire body weight into it, her shoulder screaming in protest. A groan of metal, a shudder, and then a deep, thrumming vibration began in the pipes. A low hiss escaped, and the air around the manifold instantly frosted over. "It's working!" she cried, relief and terror warring in her voice. "It's not enough," Alessandro countered, his eyes wide. "The purge will overwhelm the room before the core is inert. We need a catalyst for the reaction, a thermal sink." His gaze fell upon the only thing in the room designed to withstand impossible forces, the shattered, half-forged sphere of Livia's alloy on the central workbench. It was their only hope. It was heavy, impossibly dense. He sprinted to it. "Help me!" 15 seconds. Together they strained, muscles burning, to lift the gleaming 50-kilo sphere. It was like trying to lift a piece of a fallen star. They staggered towards the roaring chronometer, the heat wash from its core, now a palpable, scorching force. "On 3, Alessandro grunted, his face a mask of raw effort. 1, 2, 3. With a final, unified cry of exertion, they heaved the sphere into the maw of the machine. The impact was cataclysmic. The blue light collapsed inward, consumed by the alloy. For a single, terrifying moment, all sound ceased. The alarm, the hum, the hissing, all vanished, swallowed by a profound, absolute silence. The world held its breath. Then came the concussion, not of heat, but of cold. The energy transfer was instantaneous. The superheated core, robbed of its thermal energy by the alloy, caused a violent implosion. The liquid nitrogen from the cooling loop, its pressure suddenly unopposed, erupted from the machine not as a gas, but as a shockwave of white, crystalline fog that blasted outwards. Alessandro threw his body over Clara, shielding her as the wave of absolute zero hit them. It was a pain unlike any other, a silent, burning frost that stole the air from their lungs and seemed to freeze time itself. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise that had preceded it. It was a profound, ringing emptiness, the sound of a world that had been pushed to the brink and had somehow, impossibly, held. Slowly, the thick, cryogenic fog began to dissipate, revealing a landscape transformed. The workshop was a crystal palace. A delicate, feathered layer of frost coated every surface, glittering like diamond dust in the cold blue glow of the emergency lights. Alessandro pushed himself up, his movements stiff, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked down at Clara, who was huddled beneath him, shivering uncontrollably. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but her eyes were open, wide with a stunned, fragile awe. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a shard of ice from her hair. In that moment, there was no billionaire, no waitress. There were only 2 survivors, bound by the shared memory of a silence that had almost been eternal. His gaze shifted across the room. Julian Sterling lay slumped against the wall, conscious but broken, his leg trapped, his face a mask of defeated agony. The chronometer was a dead, fractured thing, its brilliant core now a dull, blackened ruin, a web of frost sealing its wounds. With a soft chime, the emergency lockdown disengaged. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing Dante and his security team, weapons raised, their faces grim and prepared for the worst. They froze, taking in the Arctic tableau. Dante's eyes found Alessandro. "Sir," he said, his voice hushed. "Status report." Alessandro didn't look away from Clara. He helped her to her feet, his arm a steady, solid presence around her shoulders. He felt the fine tremor running through her body and pulled her closer. "The threat is neutralized," Alessandro said, his voice quiet but resonant in the frozen air. He finally looked at Dante, but his words were for her. "The legacy is safe." He had stopped thinking of it as an asset. It was something more vital, more human. The next few hours were a blur of controlled, efficient motion. Medics attended to Julian, his pained whimpers the only sound as they cut him free. Forensic teams in sterile white suits moved through the frost-covered workshop, documenting the scene. And through it all, Alessandro and Clara sat in an adjacent study, wrapped in thick thermal blankets, sipping scalding hot tea that did little to warm the chill deep in their bones. They didn't speak. There were no words for what they had just endured. Instead, they communicated in the quiet language of shared space. When her hand trembled, his would steady it. When his gaze drifted towards the sealed workshop door, a flicker of the horror returning to his eyes, she would clear her throat softly, bringing him back to the present, to the solid reality of the room. They were two pillars, holding each other up in the aftermath of an earthquake. Later, after the statements had been given and the lawyers had begun to circle, he took her to a private suite on a lower floor. It was warm, quiet, and devoid of any machinery. "You should rest," he said, his voice still rough. He stood awkwardly by the door, a man of immense power, suddenly unsure of his own place. Clara looked at him. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying clarity. "You lied to me," she said, her voice not accusatory but flat, a statement of fact. "In the restaurant. You said you hired me to translate, but you were looking for the locket, for the catalyst." He didn't deny it. He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a weary honesty. "Yes. When I saw your name, Bellini, and heard the dialect, I hoped. I didn't know for certain until I saw the locket. It was a desperate gamble, one I had no right to ask you to take part in." "You pointed a gun at me," she whispered, the memory a fresh phantom in the room. The mask of control on his face finally cracked. A deep, profound pain surfaced in his eyes. "That was the only move I had left. Julian understands only one language: leverage. He saw you as my weakness, a tool to be used against me. I had to make him believe you were expendable, that you meant nothing." He took a hesitant step closer. "It was the hardest lie I have ever told, because in that moment I realized it was the furthest thing from the truth. You weren't the key to the metal, Clara. You were the key to everything else." She watched his face, the subtle shifts in the muscles around his jaw, the raw vulnerability in his stormy grey eyes. She saw the man behind the myth, a man as trapped by his legacy as she had been by her circumstances. "Get some sleep, Alessandro," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his first name. It hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge being built over a chasm of chaos. He nodded, a barely perceptible motion, and quietly let himself out, leaving her alone with the silence, which for the first time felt less like an absence and more like a beginning. The battle for Sterling Industries was not fought in a frozen workshop, but in the sterile, wood-panelled chill of the boardroom. Julian, his leg in a cast and his career in ruins, had launched a final, desperate gambit from his hospital bed. A proxy war, painting Alessandro as an unstable recluse who had destroyed the company's most valuable prototype and nearly killed them all. Alessandro sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a silent, imposing figure. He presented the facts with cold, irrefutable logic: security footage of Julian's forced entry, financial records of his attempts to siphon funds, expert testimony on the chronometer's defensive failsafe. Yet he could feel the board wavering. They were men of commerce, and he was speaking a language of crisis. They saw a shattered machine and a legacy in ashes. Then the doors opened, and Clara walked in. She was not dressed in a waitress uniform or a borrowed thermal blanket, but in a simple, elegant dark grey dress that mirrored the colour of Alessandro's suit. She moved with a quiet confidence that turned every head. "Mr. Sterling has allowed me to address the board," she began, her voice clear and steady. She didn't look at spreadsheets or reports. She looked at the faces around the table. "For months, you have heard about Livia Sterling's work as an asset, a patent, a formula worth trillions. You've been told a story of metal. I am here to tell you a story of a woman." She opened a leather-bound journal, one of Livia's. In the original Latin, her voice flowing with the lyrical cadence of the valley, she read a passage. Then she translated. They see a cold alloy, but I see the iron of our mountains, the silver of our streams, the resilience of our people. They seek a key to unlock its power, but they do not understand. The key is not the metal, but the hand that shapes it. A hand must be guided by purpose, to build, not to break, to connect, not to conquer, to measure time, not for its own sake, but for the moments that give it meaning. She closed the book. Julian Sterling saw a weapon, a commodity. He tried to take it by force, and the legacy destroyed itself rather than be misused. Alessandro Sterling saw his mother's work, and he fought to protect its soul. The alloy was never the prize, the purpose was. That is the foundation upon which Sterling Industries was built, and it is the one on which it must be rebuilt. A silence fell over the room, deeper than any they had known before. Clara hadn't won a legal argument. She had redefined the very terms of victory. She had translated not a language, but a legacy. When the vote was called, it was unanimous. Later, Clara sat by her grandmother's bedside in the new sun-drenched room at the neurological facility. The scent of lavender and old books filled the air. Elena Bellini's hands, gnarled with age and arthritis, lay still on the crisp white sheets. Clara had been reading her Livia's journals for weeks. "She missed you, Nonna," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She wrote about you all the time, about your laughter, about how your hands could coax the soul out of a broken clock." She took her grandmother's hand. It was frail, but there was a flicker of the old strength in it. "Nonna, Livia wrote that you left the valley after an argument. She never said what it was about. For a long moment there was nothing. Then her grandmother's eyelids fluttered. Her lips, dry and pale, parted. A single raspy word escaped, a ghost of the Ladin dialect. "Bambino." Child. The realization struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. The argument, the reason her grandmother had fled, hiding for 25 years. It wasn't about the alloy, it was about Alessandro. Livia wanted to bring her son into the modern world, to give him a life beyond the isolated valley. The elders, and perhaps even Eleanor, had feared the outside world would corrupt him and their secrets. Eleanor had not abandoned her friend. She had been trying to protect her. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed her grandmother's hand. "He's okay, Nonna," she whispered. "He's a good man. You would be proud." A faint pressure answered her grip. It was enough. 6 months later, they stood on a windswept ridge overlooking the Valle d'Ombra. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of pine and cold stone. The valley below was a patchwork of deep greens and slate greys, exactly as Livia had described it in her journals. They had come not as conquerors returning with untold wealth, but as pilgrims. They had already met with the village elders. There was no talk of patents or profits. Instead, they had presented the charter for the Livia Elena Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing global apprenticeships for the valley's young artisans, ensuring their craft would not die, but evolve. They were not taking the secret of the alloy. They were giving the valley a bridge to the world, the very thing Livia had always wanted. Alessandro stood beside Clara, his hands in the pockets of his thick wool coat. The haunted look that had shadowed his features for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. He was no longer a recluse hiding in a tower, but a man standing firmly on the soil of his ancestors. "I never understood," he said, his voice carried by the wind, "why my mother chose to write everything in the dialect. I thought she was being sentimental, trying to cling to a past I couldn't share." He turned to look at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "I was wrong. It wasn't for the past. It was for the future. It was a lock, and she was waiting for the right person to come along with the key. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was not a diamond, but a simple, unadorned ring. It was forged from the single, perfect sphere of alloy that had saved their lives, its surface shimmering with an internal, silvery light. I spent 20 years surrounded by silence, Clara. I thought it was a prison. But you walked into it, and you taught me its language. You showed me it didn't have to be an absence of sound, but a presence of understanding. He didn't kneel. He simply stood before her, on the edge of the world, holding the ring out as an offering. I am not a man of poetry. My mother was the artist. But her work, my work, it is all meaningless without a hand to shape it, without a purpose to guide it. His storm-grey eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not a request, but a reflection of her own soul. "Clara Bellini," he said, his voice low and certain. "Will you build with me?" She looked from the ring, a perfect circle of impossible strength forged in fire and ice, to the man who held it. The man who had seen her, not as a means to an end, but as the end of a long and lonely search. A radiant smile, genuine and unrestrained, lit up her face. She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It felt warm against her skin, as if it held the memory of all the hands that had come before. Then she reached out, took his hand, and laced her fingers through his. She didn't need to speak. Their purpose was now shared, looking out over the ancient valley with the promise of a new future before them. She gave him her answer in the quiet, profound language that had started it all, a language that was now uniquely theirs. Il nostro equilibrio. Our balance.